Today, we are going to be fishing a lake full of grass to show you how to find bass 10 times faster on grass lakes. There are always those lakes that have incredible looking grass or lily pads, but it always seems tough to find the fish. In today's video, we're going to show you the secret tricks to dissect all that grass on your favorite lake or pond and get right to catching the fish. To do so, we will first start by covering the different types of grasses and when bass use which type of grass. Then we will also cover bait selection and, depending upon the type of grass that you're fishing, how to use those baits to your advantage. And then lastly, we will go out on the water and break down some grass spots and show you the tricks to locating and catching these fish. So stay tuned, and by the end of today's video, you'll be able to catch more bass on your favorite grass fishery. So before we can get out on the water and actually show you how to find these fish in the grass, we first have to talk about why the bass use the grass and what types of grass you're going to encounter, because that's going to change the way that you approach these fish when you're getting out there. So there's two main categories of grass, the first being emergent grass and then the second being submergent grass. So emergent grass is going to grow up and above the water, and then submergent grass is going to grow beneath the water's surface. Occasionally it'll reach the top of the water, but more often than not, that grass is going to be below the surface of the water. So within those two categories, a couple examples of types of grass you're going to see within each of those. For your emergent grass, you're going to see types of grasses like lily pads. They grow up and out of the water. Reeds is another very good one. And then different types of bank grass like Kissimmee grass. And then for your submergent grasses, this is where a lot of the popular grasses come into play. Like eelgrass is one of my favorites, hydrilla, milfoil. Those are probably the top three submergent grasses. And then there's other kinds, if you live up in the Northeast like me, that you'll encounter different types of like pondweed, curly leaf pondweed, stuff like that. And then other types of little weird grasses. I call it string grass. It's like they grow like little strands. But overall, the main types you're going to encounter are going to be those main types of submergent grasses. But the fish will use all of it. So any type of grass that they can get around, they will utilize it. And the reason that bass get around grass, it can vary based on the type of grass as well. But the majority of the reasons that they'll get around grass, number one is cover. So they'll use it for shade. They'll use it for a place to go in the summer for cooler water. If they're going offshore on that submergent grass, they'll use it just as something to hold against, because they're not just going to go roam out in the middle of the lake. If they have some cover or like a patch of grass they can hang around. The second thing is, more often than not, the grasses will draw bait fish to them, whether the bait fish use it for cover as well, trying to hide from predator fish like bass, or they'll, on offshore grass specifically, a lot of microorganisms will grow on those types of grasses out there, and the bait fish will actually use it to feed out there. So while they're using it as a feeding ground, the bass know that all the bait fish are there, and they'll go use it as a feeding ground too. And then the last thing that they really use grass for is more specific to summertime fishing. Places like lily pads and stuff like that, they'll use it for shade and cooler water, trying to get that cooler water that they can experience than they can just sitting out in the open up here. But more importantly, that offshore grass, when it's growing and taking the nutrients out of the water, just like a plant would grow on the actual ground, what it's doing is distributing oxygen into the water. It might not be a lot, but it's enough that it literally takes in CO2 and distributes oxygen just like a tree would in the real world here. So it's doing the same thing to those fish. So in the summer, when water gets hot, oxygen levels deplete faster. So if they can get around grass, even if it's just a little bit more oxygen out there, it draws everything to it. But first, we got to talk about some bait selection before we can go do that. While the grass can limit what you actually can throw around it, because you have to work your bait through the grass without getting hung up, there are tons of options you can still fish for grass fishing. Almost everything in your tackle box of some kind will work on these types of grass. Again, the type of grass you approach is going to change the baits that you approach. But here is my number one tip to make grass fishing easier when you're out there looking for these fish. Do not overcomplicate it on bait selection. I keep a top, middle, bottom approach, just like I'm pond fishing. When I used to pond fish as a kid, I would tie on a topwater lure, a middle depth lure, and a bottom lure, and that's all I would fish with. I would go around the pond and try and catch fish. I do the same thing in the grass because it makes it easier to know if you're around fish. What I'm gonna be doing if I'm in submergent grass, I'm gonna be throwing some type of a topwater lure. I like hard bait topwaters when I'm fishing over submergent grass, so something like a popper or a walk the dog style bait. Those are usually my favorites. Even a whopper plopper could work really good. Today we're going with the 6th Sense popper here. And then for my middle approach in submergent grass, I almost always choose a chatterbait. That's about my favorite thing ever to fish some grass. Again, this one I can just cover water and catch some fish with it. And my last bait for fishing in submergent grass is going to be a Senko. So this is a Nico rigged Senko, but you could also fish it as a weightless wacky rig. And then when I get to my emergent vegetation, I'm gonna go with a frog. You cannot beat a frog in the lily pads and some emergent vegetation and stuff like that. But there are some other topwaters you can fish around emergent vegetation. I could throw a popper around the edges of these lily pads. My second option for fishing around emergent vegetation, I'm actually gonna ditch the chatterbait and I'm gonna go with a swim jig here because it splits through the grass. So if I'm fishing this through lily pads, especially if you have braid on, I don't have braid on today, but it will actually split the lily pads and come through, and you can like snake your way through all the lily pads and still fish a middle approach through very dense lily pads just like this. And then my last bait that I'm gonna go with for emergent vegetation is going to just be a Texas rig. So today I have a Texas rig Senko. If you're doing some flipping and some heavier vegetation, like even behind me here, I could have probably put on like a 1/2 ounce weight and a beaver and some braid and like flipped with a Texas rig. It's really just what you can, one, efficiently get through the type of cover that you're trying to fish, and two, have the most confidence in. If you like a spinnerbait better than chatterbait, throw that as your middle bait. If you like a drop shot over a wacky rig Senko, throw that as your bottom bait. Now the last thing you're gonna notice about my bait selection, and it's noticeable on both the emergent and submergent side, is I have 2 reaction baits and I'll have 1 slow moving bait. When I'm searching for these fish, I want as many reaction baits as I can get away with. So when I get to an area, I can just cover water, cover water, cover water until I find those fish. And what we're gonna talk about here later is when you're fishing these big grass flats, there will be fish scattered all over and you're trying to find the sweet spot. So for me, I could work really slowly through with the Senko and just pitch, pitch, pitch to all the different grass clumps and slowly find those fish. Am I gonna catch more fish with this? Absolutely, I'm gonna catch more fish than this with a chatterbait most times. But this will find them faster. So on a big expansive lake full of grass, I can cover water with this chatterbait. Will I only catch 1 or 2? Yes, but if I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna fish this through the grass and I catch a fish, now I know that there's a fish there, and more likely than not, they're gonna gang up on small little areas, and then I can follow up with the slower moving bait afterwards and know that I'm fishing it in an area with fish and see how many fish are in that spot. So now let's head to the water. We're gonna show you what some submergent vegetation looks like. We're gonna try and catch some fish off of it, and we're gonna show you how I break down an area full of submergent vegetation to try and catch some fish. And then after we do some submergent vegetation, we're gonna come and fish some emergent vegetation and see if we can catch a couple fish doing that too. So we just pulled up to our first stop that we're gonna fish with this submerged grass here. For the most part, this is just some of that like string grass that I was talking about. I don't really know what species of grass it is. It's just something that we get a ton of up here in the Northeast. And as long as it's green, the fish will get in it. There is tons and tons and tons of it out here though. Like we talked about, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fish my way around with the chatterbait and try and get a bite or 2 to narrow down where these fish are really sitting. I'll cover a ton of water, I'll fish fast, I'll look for a bite. There we go, just like that. That was not planned whatsoever. I was literally just about to say we got some wind blowing in here, so it was gonna probably make for a good chatterbait bite. It's not a big fish by any means, but literally like my second cast, blasted one. It's a flat with a point outside of 2 spawning coves. So those fish could come out of either side, stage up here. I got some bluegill beds on my 360. I got some string grass, and I got a bass. So let's show you this spot and we'll get back to fishing and show you how to break down the area even more. So typically after I catch one, I would go down and slow down in that area, but since that was so quick, I'm gonna see if I can get any more on the chatterbait just because I like catching him on the chatterbait. So he ate that very aggressively. So all I'm gonna do is kind of just like fan cast my way around this area, and then if I don't get any more bites on the chatterbait, before I get off spot lock or pick the power poles up, whatever I do, I'll throw the Nico rig in there, a few casts before I get off of spot lock and move around some more. All right, I've taken quite a few casts with no bites. So now what we're gonna do, we'll throw the Nico rig in there and see if there's any more fish in that area that want to bite. So I thoroughly fished this area with the Nico rig and got no more bites. So I'm assuming I probably just got very lucky and landed right on that fish for whatever reason. So we're gonna pick the chatterbait back up and we're just gonna keep cruising this grass flat until we can maybe locate where another school of them might be. So we made a little move out to this island that's in the middle of the lake here, protected from the wind a little bit, and it is covered in grass. I mean, this looks prime. The water clarity is much better out here. This is, can't tell what type of grass this is either, but it looks very green, which means there should be some fish in it. So again, we're gonna fan cast the area, kind of cover this point that I'm looking at here. The ideal scenario would be if I could find some bait in some of this grass, because the fish are definitely relating to the bait. Okay, so we just fished this giant flat that looks absolutely incredible. It's loaded with bait, the water's clean. I honestly believe there should be fish here. So this is one of those rare occasions where I will actually pick up a finesse bait. They might be actually down in the grass with how sunny it is. So we're gonna go to a bottom bait, and I already got a fish on. I missed him. That might have been a perch as well, but it's just telling me that there is a ton of bait down there, which means there should be fish down there. So we'll kind of work through this area with a finesse bait and see if we can get any more bites. Oh my gosh, there's a ton of bait down there. This is what bait looks like on live scope right here. I can see it all stacked up against the edge of this grass. There's bait, there's grass, there's fish. Well, there should be fish. That's the only thing we haven't found yet. Got that one. Immediately caught one as soon as I switched up to the Senko. And it is loaded with bait down there. This guy choked on it pretty good. We're gonna get him off and get him back in the water. So we finally caught us a fish out of this big grass flat that looks incredible. So I hit spot lock, and now I'll pick that area apart and see if we can catch some more. I knew there had to be fish there. There was just way too much bait. The water's clean, the grass is perfect. I mean, everything these fish need is right here. We got another one. That's a bigger one. That's a big one. Yep, that's a big one. Oh, this is gonna be fun. This is how they get schooled up out here. Oh, this is gonna be fun. There we go. Look at that one. That is a nice fish there. This is one of my favorite techniques for fishing up in the Northeast. We'll talk about it here in just a second, but look at that fish. We'll get rigged up. I'll show you literally my favorite technique for almost any northern lake. I crush them on this little technique. All right, so if you guys fish in the Northeast, you fish grass lakes at all. I've done this on the Potomac, the Chesapeake, Champlain, Cayuga, Chautauqua, all different kinds of lakes. Any type of lake like that where you have a ton of grass, it's all scattered, you don't really know how to catch them. In the summertime, you can't beat a Senko, but it's very painful and slow to fish a weightless Senko. So what I started doing, this isn't a Senko, by the way, this is a 6th Sense Clout. If you want to check out any of the gear we talked about throughout today's video, it'll all be linked down below. If you want to get any of the 6th Sense products, you can use my code Quince, you'll save 10% off your order. I take a 3/0 hook, extra wide gap. The key is this 3/0 hook, it gives it a lot of action. You could go up to a 5, but for whatever reason, the smaller hook gives this worm more action, catches more fish. It still has a shimmy. And then I put just an 1/8 ounce weight, no peg, 15-pound test straight fluorocarbon on a bait caster, and you can get them hard like we just did there. And literally all you do is bomb cast this thing out there and just let that thing sink down to the bottom. Sometimes they'll pick it up on the fall like that one did. Sometimes they won't. And then I will literally just drag it through the grass, and you can work it a lot faster because it'll literally fall right back down to the bottom. So if those fish are definitely on the bottom, they're in those grass clumps, they don't want to leave that area to get food, this is a perfect bait to do it with. One of my favorite ways to fish up here in the north. Catches a lot. Like that. It's another big one. Oh my gosh. This one's big, big. Oh no, she just got all the grass with her. I mean, she's still a nice fish, but man, I thought that was a big one. This is that string grass that I'm talking about. All the lakes up here in the Northeast get this. I have no idea what kind of grass this is. That is what they live in. See how green that is and healthy? That's what they like to live in. The bait fish feeds on all the little microorganisms in it, and the bass eat the fish around it. So that's a great way to catch them. So now that we talked about submergent vegetation and how to find fish in those areas, let's talk about some emergent vegetation, which we have all over the place right in front of us here. So we have like duckweed that's growing on the surface. We have plenty of lily pads, and we actually even have submergent as well. We have some milfoil mixed into these areas. So I basically do the same thing I would do as if I was fishing submergent vegetation, and I look for the most high percentage areas. There's a million lily pads back in here. I could spend all day fishing this spot. I look for the most active fish I can find, like we talked about. A lot of times I'll go through a few different pad fields before you actually find the fish. Emergent vegetation is also much easier to break down without electronics than submergent vegetation is, because it visually gives away what's going on under the water up there. So things that I'm gonna be looking for in areas with emergent vegetation is going to be the same type of like points or turns or ditches, any type of area like that that we would look for with submerged vegetation, because that's either going to indicate a bottom hardness change or overall just gives those fish a different area to live in. The other thing we're gonna look for is areas of change. So if you have a bunch of like these tall spatter dock pads and all of a sudden there's a bunch of flat lily pads, that could indicate a bottom hardness change. Other than that, I really just look for bait. So if you know there's bluegills around, you can hear them pecking at the pads on top of the water. It's a little windy today, so you can't quite hear that, but if you know they're in the area, you know there's bait around, you find little high percentage areas, there should be fish in those areas, then it's just a matter of fishing your bait around until you find those fish. Some days they might prefer the submergent vegetation, some days they might prefer the emergent vegetation, and today seems to be one of those days they prefer the submergent stuff offshore. But use these tips no matter what type of vegetation you have on your lake, and you will be catching more fish in no time. If you don't have vegetation on your lake, check this video out right here. I break down how to find fish offshore, and that video is a complete instructional video like we just did today about grass fishing, but for offshore fishing. So check that one out, hit the subscribe button down below, and thanks for watching.